Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Most leaders still talk about Microsoft 365 like it's just software, or perhaps a bundle of tools for email, files, and meetings with some workflow on top. But if you look closely, that story is already out of date because the business is no longer just using these tools for tasks. Your organization is depending on this platform like its core operating infrastructure, and once Copilot, governance, identity, and data all start interacting in the same environment, a simple misunderstanding gets expensive very fast. So in this episode, I want to show you why Microsoft 365 has crossed a critical architectural line. It is not just helping the business work anymore, but in many organizations, it has become the actual environment where the business runs. If you are building on Microsoft 365 as true business infrastructure, you should subscribe to the M365 FM podcast. Let me take one step back and explain why this misunderstanding keeps showing up in boardrooms and IT departments alike. The familiar story leaders still tell themselves. The familiar story usually goes like this. Microsoft 365 is where the email lives, Teams is where the meetings happen, and SharePoint serves as the place where documents go. OneDrive handles personal storage while Power Automate manages a few useful automations, and then we treat Copilot as the smart assistant we can just add on later. That story still sounds reasonable to most people because it was true enough for a long time. And why was that? Because in the earlier phases of cloud adoption, most organizations were still thinking in workloads rather than architecture. They were simply replacing on-prem tools by moving familiar functions into the cloud, so Exchange became Exchange Online, and old file shares turned into SharePoint sites. Skype turned into Teams while the language stayed operational and local, focusing on which tool was rolling out or which specific team owned the budget. So the executive memory got fixed right there. For many leaders, Microsoft 365 still sits in the mind as a licensing conversation or a migration project rather than a strategic foundation. They focus on E3 versus E5 licenses or the latest Teams rollout, and they worry about SharePoint intranet refreshes or end-user training to drive a productivity score. None of that is technically wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete now. Because if you only remember the platform as a bundle of services, you will manage it like a collection of disconnected products. You will optimize locally, which means treating Teams only for meetings and SharePoint only for files, while Entra stays hidden as security plumbing. But here's the thing. Local optimization made sense when the business dependency was still shallow and the impact of a mistake was small. When Teams was mostly for video calls and automation was just a tactical fix, loose ownership and inconsistent structures could survive without breaking the company. Different departments could create their own messy patterns, and since the platform still looked healthy from the outside, nobody felt the need to intervene. That is the trap. The technology changed shape so gradually that the leadership model never got forced to change all at once. Nobody wakes up one morning and realizes they have built an enterprise operating system inside their tenant, but instead the shift happens quietly through 1,000 small habits. A critical decision gets made in a Teams thread, an approval happens through an automated flow, and a vital record ends up living in a SharePoint library. Knowledge gets spread across channels, mailboxes, and meeting recaps, while permissions and labels define exactly who can see or protect that information. Identity determines who has the power to act, and then AI arrives to start traversing every single bit of that data. Now map that to how we work today. What used to be just collaboration now carries the weight of corporate memory, process, and control. The same tenant now contains your business signals and your actual behavior, which means this isn't a software footprint anymore, it's an operating footprint. And this is where many leadership teams get stuck in a dangerous half-truth. They can see high usage numbers and people collaborating more than ever, and they see lower email volumes, so they naturally assume the system is mature. But activity is not architecture. Actually, let me say that more clearly. High activity inside Microsoft 365 does not prove the environment is well designed. It only proves the environment is being used. And if the structure underneath that usage is weak, then the platform scales confusion instead of clarity. It scales duplication instead of truth, and it scales access instead of actual control. From a system perspective, that's not just a governance issue, it's a business reality issue. Because the moment your business depends on the tenant to coordinate work and ground your AI, the nature of accountability changes. The question is no longer whether people are using the tools you bought, but the real question becomes what kind of business behavior this platform is producing at scale. That's a different conversation entirely. It moves Microsoft 365 out of the productivity software bucket and into the business operating model bucket. And once that happens, leadership can't delegate the meaning of the platform downward to the technical teams anymore. The technology team can manage the configuration and security can manage the controls, but none of them own the business architecture the tenant is creating by default. Which brings us to the structural shift underneath all of this. Scale changes the meaning of the same technology. When a tool quietly becomes infrastructure. So what does this shift actually look like in practice? A tool is something people pick up when they choose to use it, but infrastructure is something the business depends on, whether anyone notices it or not. That is the fundamental difference. When a tool breaks, it might be annoying for a few users, but when infrastructure breaks, it fundamentally changes business outcomes. And this is exactly where most Microsoft 365 conversations stay far too shallow. If Teams goes down for an hour in a large organization, it is no longer just a minor communication inconvenience for the staff. Meetings stop, internal coordination slows to a crawl, and critical escalations get delayed while important decisions simply wait. When a SharePoint structure is inconsistent, it is not just a case of messy storage because it actively damages information retrieval, user trust, and process repeatability. If permissions begin to drift, that is not just a security concern for IT, but a change in who can act, what people can see, and what AI is allowed to surface. When identity controls are weak, that vulnerability does not stay confined to the technical department, but moves straight into the heart of business operations. That is how infrastructure behaves. The test for your organization is actually very simple. If the platform fails, drifts, fragments, or loses the trust of your people, does the business continue to operate cleanly? In more and more organizations today, the answer to that question is a resounding no. Microsoft 365 now carries far more than just your daily messages and files. And while it handles communication, it also manages coordination, approvals, and working knowledge. It holds your shared records, external sharing permissions, policy enforcement, and searchability boundaries. And in many cases, it even runs lightweight business applications and core process automation. When people claim it is just a place where they collaborate, they are only describing the surface while completely missing the massive dependency underneath. And why is that so easy for leaders to miss? It happened because cloud convenience effectively masked architectural importance. The platform became much easier to consume at the exact same time it became more structurally central to the business. You did not need a giant infrastructure project for every new capability, so you could turn on Teams, create sites quickly, and add flows or Copilot licenses whenever you wanted. That speed felt like simplicity to the end user, but we have to remember that speed and simplicity are not the same thing. This clicked for me when I started looking at tenant problems the same way I would look at production architecture. When a business process starts depending on a platform, you do not judge that platform by how friendly the interface feels to the user. Instead, you judge it by its resilience, its control, its visibility, and the total impact of a failure. Can we trust the data that comes back? Can we trace exactly how the system works? Can we recover the environment when it breaks? Can we scale the system without multiplying the confusion? That is what I call infrastructure thinking. Most leaders do not apply that lens to Microsoft 365 because the shift happened without a major reclassification event. Nobody renamed the budget line, and nobody stood up to say that your collaboration suite was now part of the enterprise control plane. Because of that, responsibility for the system stayed fragmented across different departments. The Teams team focuses on enablement, the SharePoint team focuses on content, the security team focuses on protection, the compliance team focuses on retention, the automation team focuses on flows, but the business is experiencing all of this as one single connected environment. That is the gap we have to close. From the outside, the tenant can still look perfectly functional because people are chatting, files are moving, and meetings are running as usual. Underneath that surface, however, fragmentation can be growing in the form of duplicate workspaces, unclear ownership, and conflicting permissions. Nobody feels the full weight of that drift in the early stages because each local problem looks manageable when you view it on its own. Infrastructure debt always works like that, accumulating quietly in the background until scale, risk, or AI finally forces it into the light. This is not a branding change for your IT department, but a fundamental change in business dependency. That is the part I want leaders to really hear and understand. Calling Microsoft 365 an enterprise operating system is not just marketing language, but a way of naming the level of dependency the business already has. Once communication, knowledge, identity, policy, and automation all converge in one platform boundary, the platform starts behaving less like optional software and more like operating infrastructure. And once that happens, your accountability must change along with it. You cannot manage infrastructure using adoption logic alone. You cannot govern a dependency this large with project-based thinking. And you certainly cannot layer AI on top of fragmented foundations and expect trust to suddenly appear. Now map that reality to how we actually work today. The early warning signals we keep misreading. If Microsoft 365 has already crossed into infrastructure territory, then the next question is obvious. How do you know when the platform has outgrown the way you are currently managing it? Usually the answer does not show up as one dramatic system failure, but as a series of small signals that leaders treat as isolated annoyances. You might see 3 different project spaces for one initiative, 5 versions of the same sales deck, or a SharePoint site that nobody owns but everyone still uses. You find channels where important decisions are buried deep inside threads with no clear record kept outside of that specific conversation. From a local point of view, each of these issues looks manageable. Someone suggests a quick cleanup. Someone else says users just need better naming conventions. Security wants to review permissions. Compliance wants to flip a switch on another policy. But here's the thing most people miss. These are not just random messes, but early signals that the environment is producing unmanaged business behavior. If the same decision can live in a chat, an email, a file, and a meeting recap all at once, then the business no longer has a clear source of truth. It has competing truth surfaces, and once that happens, trust starts dropping long before anyone says a word about it out loud. This is where leaders often confuse high activity with actual coherence. The tenant looks alive because people are collaborating and meetings are happening, so the environment feels healthy to those watching the metrics. But healthy systems are not defined by motion alone, as they must be defined by clarity, repeatability, and structural control. If nobody can answer simple questions about where information lives or who owns a workspace, you are already seeing the warning signals. When the approved version of a document or the access rights for a project depend on who you ask, the platform is drifting, and drift inside an operating environment is never a neutral event. It creates retrieval friction and duplicated work, which eventually leads to oversharing and manual checking as a form of structural compensation. People stop trusting the search function, so they ask questions in chat, and they stop trusting the site, so they save another local copy. They stop trusting the permissions, so they limit sharing manually, and they stop trusting the automation, so they add human review steps everywhere. That is not just isolated user behavior, but a direct system outcome. One of the clearest warning signs is the growth of multiple sources of truth for the same business decision. That phrase might sound abstract, but the business effect is very concrete because decision speed slows down and meetings get longer. Approvals start requiring extra confirmation, and leaders begin asking for one more export or one more screenshot just to be sure. The environment no longer gives people confidence that what they are seeing is the right thing in the right place. Once that confidence drops, the business starts building expensive workarounds on top of the platform instead of working inside it. Another warning signal appears when compliance controls are technically enabled but operationally weak. Labels might exist in the system, but if labeling is inconsistent and content is scattered, the underlying structure is too fragmented to interpret. From a reporting perspective, it can still look like governance is present, but from a system perspective, the entire setup is fragile. Controls do not become strong just because you turn them on in the admin center. They become strong when the underlying environment is structured enough for those controls to actually mean something. This is exactly why AI has become such a useful diagnostic tool for the modern enterprise. Copilot and other automation agents do not come in to repair your structural weakness, as they simply interact with whatever is already there. If your permissions are messy, the AI will respect that mess, and if your knowledge is fragmented, the AI will traverse that fragmentation. When labels are missing, the AI simply exposes those blind spots faster than a human ever could. When leaders say they expected a capability jump but got mixed trust instead, that is usually not an AI problem, but the platform making its own design visible. The invisible complexity was always there, but AI just made it legible. This matters because many organizations still read these signs far too late in the process. They think duplicate workspaces are just cosmetic issues and that unclear ownership is merely an administrative task for someone to handle later. They assume source of truth confusion is a cultural problem and that weak trust in AI is a model issue that Microsoft will eventually fix. But if you look closely, these are all connected signals pointing to one reality. The tenant is already behaving like enterprise infrastructure, but you are still governing it like a loose collection of tools. Once that gap appears, every new capability you add only serves to amplify the problem. And this is where the Copilot story becomes very useful. Copilot as the diagnostic tool, not the transformation. So let's use Copilot the right way. We shouldn't treat it as proof that the digital transformation has finally arrived, but rather as proof of how your environment actually behaves under pressure. That is where the real value sits. A lot of leadership teams approached Copilot as if the AI itself would create a massive step change in results. They bought the licenses, ran the demos, and showed off the meeting recaps or the automated inbox summaries. For a few weeks, that story feels very convincing because the surface experience is impressive, the interface is clean, and the use cases sound like obvious wins. But here is where most people mess up. They mistake visible capability for operational readiness. Copilot doesn't work from a slide deck version of your company because it works from your tenant reality. It traverses the Microsoft graph and interacts with the permissions, labels, files, and chats that already exist in your infrastructure. When leaders expect AI to arrive as a clean productivity layer, what they often get instead is something much more revealing. They get a mirror, and that mirror is usually uncomfortable, because Copilot isn't inventing your environment, it is simply reading it. If your knowledge model is fragmented, the response quality becomes inconsistent, and if permissions are too broad, oversharing risks become visible immediately. When content is stale or badly structured, the answers feel unreliable even when the model itself is doing exactly what it was designed to do. This is why I keep coming back to the same line. Copilot is not the transformation, it is the diagnostic tool for your operating model. And why is that? It's because AI sits at the point where all the hidden assumptions of your tenants suddenly matter at once. For years, An organization can survive with weak information architecture because the people inside the system compensate manually. They know which colleague to ask for the right version, they know which folder is a mess, and they know the unofficial Teams channel where the real answers live. Humans are surprisingly good at structural compensation, and we root around bad design all the time. AI doesn't do that. It follows the structure available to it, respects the access model it finds, and grounds itself in the content environment you've provided. If that environment is coherent, Copilot feels powerful very quickly, but if the environment is messy, the AI just makes that mess legible faster. That isn't a failure, that's a diagnosis. This is exactly why so many early Copilot reactions sound so contradictory. One team says the tool is incredible, while another says they don't trust it, and meanwhile, security is worried about permissions, while compliance is looking at unlabeled content risks. It's the same AI, but the structural conditions are different. From a system perspective, that tells you something very important. This variance isn't random, it is produced by the design quality inside your tenant. Once you see that, the conversation changes. You stop asking if Copilot is good or bad, and you start asking what kind of environment you are asking it to operate in. That is a much better question because it puts accountability back where it belongs. It isn't on the end users or the model alone, but on the platform conditions the business has already created. This clicked for a lot of organizations when they saw trust start to dip after that initial launch momentum. The demos worked and the first use cases looked promising, but then real work entered the picture with sensitive data and duplicate workspaces. Suddenly, the issue wasn't whether the AI could generate language, but whether the tenant gave that AI a reliable business substrate to work with. And that's the shortcut nobody teaches. If you want to understand your Microsoft 365 maturity, don't start by asking how many licenses you assigned. Instead, start by asking what Copilot is revealing about your platform. Where does it struggle? Where does trust drop? Where does access surprise people? Those are not side issues. Those are architectural signals. So yes, Copilot can drive value, but before it becomes a transformation engine, it usually shows you the operating model you already have. And that brings us to the pattern we keep seeing. The 6-12-week stall pattern. Let's talk about the pattern that shows up once Copilot moves from launch theater into lived reality. I've seen this enough now that I think it deserves to be treated as a structural pattern rather than a rollout accident. Weeks 1 and 2 usually look strong. Licenses get assigned, leaders get a polished demo, and people try out the obvious use cases like meeting recaps or drafting emails. The internal narrative becomes a story about how this is going to change everything. In that early moment, the story feels true because nobody has hit the full weight of tenant reality yet. Then the next phase starts. Around weeks 3 to 6, people begin using the tool for real work instead of staged work, and that changes everything. Now they expect consistency across files and teams, and they notice when one answer is strong while the next one is vague. They hit permission surprises and start asking if they should really trust this output in front of a customer. This is where the first cracks appear. It isn't because the model suddenly got worse, but because the operating environment is finally being tested. Then we hit the stall zone. This tends to peak around week 6 to 12 in deployments where governance was treated as a setup task instead of an ongoing operating process. That timing matters because it tells us that early momentum can hide structural weakness for a short period. Once AI gets pulled into repeated real business workflows, those hidden conditions surface fast. You start hearing the same signals. People aren't sure where the AI got its information, or they wonder why it missed a key document that everyone knows exists. When those questions show up without a clear operating response from the business, trust starts dropping. That trust drop is the real inflection point. AI adoption doesn't fail only when the tool stops working. It fails when people stop believing the environment is reliable enough for serious use. Then usage changes, people go back to old habits, and licenses sit there with light activity while leaders start asking for ROI proof. This is where many organizations misread the problem. They say users resisted, or the prompts were bad, or the training wasn't strong enough. Sometimes those things are part of it, but very often the deeper issue is much simpler. Governance was treated like configuration when what was actually needed was operation. That distinction matters a lot. Configuration says you enabled labels and reviewed permissions once before the pilot launched. Operation says you monitor drift, review oversharing, and fix ownership gaps to keep the environment trustworthy as usage expands. That is a completely different posture. The stall pattern is a useful signal because it shows the exact moment where a collaboration mindset runs out of road. You can launch a tool with setup logic, but you cannot scale an operating layer that way. If you remember nothing else from this part, remember this. The 6 to 12-week stall is not usually a story about AI disappointment. It is a story about operating design catching up with launch enthusiasm. From a system perspective, the behavior here is very predictable. Strong demo value creates early confidence, but real usage exposes structural inconsistency, which lowers trust and reduces adoption. That reduced adoption triggers ROI concerns, which finally forces the organization to look below the surface. By then, a lot of teams think something has gone wrong with the AI, but the system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. It is just revealing that the tenant was never prepared to act like a governed business platform under AI pressure. I don't see this as a user failure or even a technology failure. It's a system outcome. Once you understand that, you stop asking how to restart the excitement and you start asking what operating discipline was missing from the start. Let me make that concrete through one organizational case. The retail organization that mistook adoption for control. Let me make this real by looking at an organizational pattern I've seen play out dozens of times. Because while the specific details vary, the underlying structure always repeats. I was looking at a retail organization with over 10,000 people that was dealing with fast growth and a massive amount of operational movement. They had a desperate need for better coordination between their stores, regional teams, and head office functions. When they rolled out Microsoft 365, it happened quickly. And on the surface, the whole project looked like a massive win for the company. Teams' usage climbed almost immediately, email pressure started to drop, and meetings became significantly easier for everyone to organize. People were finally able to collaborate across different physical locations with much less friction than before. Leadership received positive feedback early on, and to be fair, that success was real because the platform removed genuine pain for the staff. Because the initial feedback was so good, the internal story became very familiar to anyone who has managed a large rollout. The leadership team believed the rollout worked and people had adopted the tools, which led them to the conclusion that the business was collaborating better and the environment was under control. But here's the thing, those are not the same thing at all. While usage numbers were rising, the underlying digital estate was expanding without any kind of shared architectural model to keep it steady. New teams were being created constantly, SharePoint spaces multiplied, and the tenant became a mess of project areas, department folders, and abandoned structures. None of it looked catastrophic in isolation. And because it looked like growth, the leadership team completely missed the warning signs. From a system perspective, high activity often creates a false appearance of maturity that hides structural rot. There were more conversations happening in the platform and more documents being shared, so the company started measuring success entirely through motion. They saw more usage and more engagement, but underneath that activity, a much more dangerous pattern was forming. The same business topics were suddenly spread across multiple different workspaces, and important files existed in duplicate versions that no one bothered to clean up. Ownership became unclear once projects shifted or people moved roles, which meant that temporary teams eventually turned into semi-permanent operating spaces. SharePoint structures started reflecting local convenience rather than enterprise logic, and because the platform still basically worked, nobody felt enough pressure to stop and ask the harder questions. The question shouldn't have been whether people were using the tools, but rather what kind of business structure they were actually building inside the system. That question never became central early enough to matter. What the organization really had was broad adoption without a shared model for how knowledge should live, move, or expire inside the tenant. That distinction matters because adoption only tells you that people entered the environment, but it doesn't tell you if the environment can produce reliable business outcomes at scale. This is where many organizations declare victory too early because the first wave of value in Microsoft 365 is so easy to see. Meetings improve, chat reduces the reliance on email, and file sharing feels easier, but these visible gains create a dangerous illusion if leadership assumes collaboration equals operating discipline. It doesn't. In this case, no one had defined what a core workspace should look like or who should own the lifecycle of a document. There were admins and governance discussions, but there was no unifying operating model to hold it all together. If you give people flexible tools without strong design patterns, they will solve immediate problems in immediate ways, which is a predictable result of the environment. Behavior wasn't driven by access alone. It was driven by structure, incentives, and the need for speed. Retail is especially exposed to this because the business pressure is constant and operational teams will always optimize for responsiveness over architecture. For a long time, the dashboards looked healthy and the adoption story remained strong, so leadership believed they had both growth and control. What they actually had was growth without legibility, and that difference stayed hidden until the next layer of technology arrived. When AI finally entered the system, the illusion could no longer hold. What broke first when AI entered the system? What broke first was not the AI itself, though that is the part leaders kept getting wrong during the initial rollout. When Copilot entered the environment, the first visible failure was trust rather than uptime or licensing. People would ask a reasonable question and get a useful answer once, but the next time the answer would be vague, and suddenly the whole promise started to wobble. This didn't happen because the model was inconsistent by accident, but because it was now operating against a fragmented business memory. Important information technically existed within the system, but the issue was that it did not exist in a structurally reliable way. Context lived in too many places at once. Decisions sat in chat while supporting files lived in a SharePoint site no one trusted, and a copied summary sat in someone's mailbox. When Copilot tried to reason across the tenant, it wasn't reading a coherent environment. It was traversing scattered evidence. To a user, the result feels like intelligence with massive gaps, which is actually the worst possible category for a business tool. It is close enough to be impressive but unstable enough to be risky, and that invites confidence before the system has actually earned trust. The first break was not about technical capability, but about the confidence in output quality under real business conditions. Then the second break appeared as permissions started becoming visible in a way that no one expected. For years, over-permissioning had been a quiet problem because retrieval was still manual and the exposure stayed hidden behind the friction of searching. AI collapses that retrieval cost and makes the permission model legible at speed, so when Copilot surfaced sensitive information, people naturally blamed the AI. But the AI was doing exactly what it was allowed to do by the system designers. And this is why I keep saying that permissions are the new perimeter, and since Copilot respects existing Microsoft 365 permissions, weak access design stopped being a hygiene issue and became a visible business risk. Then compliance got pulled into the story because the organization realized that controls only work as well as the structure underneath them. If unlabeled sites create blind spots for AI, then simply enabling sensitivity labels is not enough to protect the business. If content is duplicated across inconsistent workspaces, then retention and audit readiness become almost impossible to interpret. AI did something very important by turning hidden structural weakness into observable business risk, and that was the real break in the system. Once leaders saw that, many still tried to frame it as an AI quality problem or a lack of user training. Those explanations only touched the surface because the deeper issue was that the collaboration layer had grown without any operating discipline. Before AI, people compensated for weak structure through human memory and personal relationships. They knew which unofficial folder had the real file and which team site was actually current, and that human compensation kept the environment functional enough to survive. But AI doesn't compensate like that. It simply reads what exists and follows the access model you built. The moment AI arrived, the organization stopped experiencing Microsoft 365 as a set of tools and started seeing it as an interconnected operating environment. The real question changed from whether the model could generate value to whether the platform could produce trustworthy outcomes at machine speed. That is a much harder standard to meet, and it's exactly where this retail organization had to confront reality. They hadn't failed at adoption, but they had failed to define the business architecture inside the tenant, and AI simply removed the illusion that usage and control were the same thing. What an enterprise operating system actually means. So let's define this model more clearly. When I say Microsoft 365 is behaving like an enterprise operating system, I'm not just using a clever metaphor for modern work. I mean it as a practical architectural description of what the platform is already doing inside your organization. If you look closely, an operating system does a few essential things that map perfectly to our digital workspace. It allocates access, coordinates resources, creates common surfaces where work happens, and enforces the constraints that keep everything from falling apart. Now, map those functions directly to Microsoft 365. Identity decides who gets in and what they can reach, while data leaves across shared services and surfaces through the Microsoft Graph and AI grounding. Teams, SharePoint, and Outlook create the actual work surfaces where we communicate, and tools like Purview or audit logs define our compliance boundaries. Finally, Power Automate and emerging agent capabilities create an automation plane that moves information and actions across the entire environment. This is no longer just a loose toolkit of separate apps. It has become a shared operating environment. And why does this distinction matter so much? It matters because suite thinking and operating system thinking lead to very different leadership behaviors. Suite thinking asks questions about what tools we own, whether people are using them, or if the rollout landed successfully. Those are still valid questions, but they aren't enough once a platform becomes structurally central to how a business functions. Operating system thinking asks a much more serious set of questions. What business behavior does this platform actually produce? What dependencies are we creating inside it, and where does the truth live? How is access controlled when scale, regulation, or AI put pressure on the environment? When you frame it this way, every design decision inside the tenant has business consequences that go far beyond a local feature. A team's creation policy isn't just a technical setting anymore. It shapes your long-term business memory and prevents workspace sprawl. A permissions model isn't just security administration because it determines what people and AI can retrieve or expose. A weak information structure isn't just a content problem, it becomes a decision quality problem for the entire leadership team. The issue isn't whether Microsoft officially calls this an operating system. The issue is whether it already performs those functions in your organization, and in most cases the answer is clearly yes. It already coordinates your communication, mediates your access, and stores your working knowledge. It already shapes your workflow and influences what the business can see, trust, and audit. So the real question isn't whether it is the OS. The real question is whether it has been intentionally designed as one. For many organizations, the honest answer is no. The platform grew into this role gradually through migrations, convenience, and local problem solving. We are now left with a platform carrying massive operating responsibility without always having the necessary operating design. From a system perspective, that is a fragile way to run a company. Operating systems need coherence, visible rules, and shared patterns that different parts of the organization can actually rely on. Without those boundaries, the environment still runs, but the business experiences more duplication and hidden risk. There is one distinction here that really matters. An enterprise operating system is not a single monolithic application. It is a coordinated control environment where the power and the risk comes from the fact that these layers interact. This is exactly why Copilot matters so much in this story. It's not because AI suddenly created the platform, but because AI made the existing interdependence visible to everyone. Once a system can reason across your files, permissions, and workflows, the illusion of separate tools becomes impossible to maintain. If we accept that Microsoft 365 is already functioning this way, we have to stop describing it workload by workload and start understanding it layer by layer. The identity layer. The first layer we have to look at is identity. This is where the model stops being abstract, because identity is not just a security service sitting off to the side. In Microsoft 365, identity is the control plane for every business action. It decides who can enter, what they can publish, and increasingly what AI agents can do on your behalf. A lot of organizations still treat Entra ID as technical plumbing that stays invisible unless it breaks. But if you look closely, identity is shaping your business reality all day long. Role assignments decide who has administrative power, while conditional access decides the specific conditions under which work is allowed to happen. Group memberships define who sees what, and privileged identity management determines whether elevated access is controlled or just sitting there waiting to be abused. That isn't background infrastructure, that is operating logic. And why is that? It's because in a platform environment, access is behavior. If I can retrieve a document, summarize a mailbox, or deploy an agent, that isn't just a permissions event, it's a business capability event. Identity is the layer that decides what actions are possible, which means weak identity design eventually turns into weak business control. This matters even more now because the perimeter has changed. For years, we were trained to think in network boundaries like internal versus external or on-prem versus cloud. But once your data and AI sit inside the same tenant, those old boundaries become less useful. Permissions are the new perimeter because the platform is constantly asked to act based on what an identity allows. Copilot makes this reality very obvious. Since Copilot respects existing permissions, it won't magically hide things if the environment says access is allowed. If your sites are over-permissioned or your guest access is loose, AI doesn't fix that problem. It scales the consequence of that design. This is why role granularity is so important for structural resilience. Not everyone should be a global administrator, and not every admin task needs full tenant power. Microsoft keeps expanding its role model for this exact reason. There are now specialized roles for security, compliance, and AI administration because mature operating systems must separate duties. They reduce the blast radius and make accountability clearer so you can run the platform with precision instead of just crossing your fingers. The tricky part is that identity maturity isn't just about cutting off access. It's about making that access legible, proportional, and easy to review. You need to be able to explain why a role exists, show who owns it, and remove it the moment it isn't needed. If you can't trace which human or non-human identity performed a sensitive action, your control plane is already becoming fragile. This gets even more relevant as AI agents become first-class actors in our environment. We are moving into a world where agents and service identities need the same governance as people. They need sponsorship, lifecycle control, and least privilege, or you risk creating a new category of invisible operators inside your business. From a system perspective, that is a single point of failure waiting to happen. So if you want to know if Microsoft 365 is functioning as your enterprise operating system, start right here. Look at identity not as a technical chore, but as the business control layer that allocates trust and reach across your entire organization. But identity alone doesn't create a complete system because knowing who can act is only half the story. The next question is what they are acting on, where that knowledge lives, and whether the platform can actually ground its decisions in something reliable. The data layer. Now we move into the data layer. Most conversations about Microsoft 365 stay on the surface because people treat this as a storage problem, but the real issue is business memory. Data in this environment isn't just sitting in a digital filing cabinet waiting for someone to open a folder. It is constantly being surfaced, searched, and reasoned over by the system itself. The platform is busy classifying information, copying it into automated workflows, and increasingly using it to ground the responses you get from AI. This means the system isn't just holding your information, it is actively interpreting and activating it every single day. That shifts the standard for what good looks like. If identity determines who is allowed to act, then data determines what the platform is actually capable of knowing. When that knowledge is fragmented, stale, or weakly structured, The business feels that weakness in every single interaction. You see it in poor search results, slow decision speeds, and low-quality automation. It shows up in a lack of audit confidence, and very quickly, it destroys any trust the users had in AI tools. Take a look at the actual estate you're managing. You have SharePoint, OneDrive, and Exchange. You have Teams messages, shared files, and Dataverse. You have a constant stream of signals flowing through the Microsoft Graph. This represents a massive surface area for business memory. Some of it is unstructured, some is highly organized, but from a systems perspective, the platform treats all of it as usable context. That is an incredibly powerful capability to have at your disposal, but it is also a significant risk. Once an environment can reason across all these different surfaces at once, the location of a file matters much less than whether that memory is legible enough to be trusted. This is where the concept of data gravity becomes useful. When the truth is spread across too many disconnected places, people naturally start creating their own copies to keep things moving. Those copies eventually become different versions. Those versions turn into widespread confusion, and soon every process slows down because teams are wasting time reconciling facts. This isn't just a simple content management headache for IT, it is a structural drag on the entire business that prevents any real momentum. And why does this happen so consistently? It happens because unstructured convenience will always scale faster than intentional data design. One team drops critical files into a random workspace. Another team creates a second copy just to save a few seconds. A workflow starts pulling data from a list that no one has updated in months. A key decision sits buried in an email thread while the supporting document lives somewhere else entirely. Everything the business needs still exists, but it doesn't exist in a way the platform can reliably interpret. That is the exact moment where trust starts to break down. This is also why I believe Dataverse matters much more than most Microsoft 365 leaders realize. I'm not saying every single document belongs there because they don't, but Dataverse provides a governed and relational core that standard collaboration spaces lack. It offers a structured model with built-in business logic and security that stays consistent across apps and workflows. When your critical information needs to be the single source of truth for AI grounding, that kind of structure creates the resilience you need. To put it simply, SharePoint is where you hold knowledge. Dataverse is where you hold operational truth. Both of these roles are vital to the system, but they perform very different jobs. If you blur the lines between them, the platform becomes much harder for the organization to trust. Once AI enters the picture, the quality of this data layer becomes impossible to ignore. Copilot isn't going to invent missing metadata for you, and it won't magically repair a broken lineage or figure out which version of a duplicate file is the authoritative one. It simply works with whatever the tenant provides. This means that labeling, metadata, and lifecycle discipline are no longer optional chores for admins. They are the baseline requirements for trustworthy reasoning. An unlabeled site quickly becomes a blind spot for the system. Over-permissioned content turns into an immediate data exposure risk. Unclear source ownership leads to answers that are unstable and unreliable. We have to treat the data layer as something much more significant than just storage architecture. It is the memory architecture of your business, and mature systems always share a few specific traits. They work to reduce duplication, they clarify which sources hold authority, and they separate flexible collaboration from structured business data. They apply labels where control matters most, and they ensure that the history of a piece of data becomes more visible over time rather than fading away. The real business problem is rarely that information is missing. The problem is that the platform cannot always distinguish what should count as reliable context. That is the gap we have to close. And once that data starts moving through the daily flow of search and automation, the way we collaborate begins to change meaning as well. The collaboration layer. Now we move to the collaboration layer, which is the area where most organizations still underestimate the impact of Microsoft 365. Teams and SharePoint are usually described as simple tools for communication and content. They are familiar and flexible, but at scale, they are doing something far more important than just sending messages. They are shaping how the business coordinates its work and where context actually accumulates. They determine how decisions stay visible and whether the knowledge of the company remains usable after the people who created it have moved on to other roles. This means collaboration is no longer just a topic for user experience. It is coordination architecture. The reason is simple. The place where people talk, share, and decide is the place where the business remembers how it operates. If that environment is coherent, work naturally gets easier over time as the system supports the people. But if it is fragmented, the business slowly loses its legibility even as the total amount of activity keeps going up. This is why workspace sprawl is such a serious issue. It isn't because having extra teams is annoying for the IT department. It's because those extra spaces distort the business memory. A duplicated workspace is almost never just an extra container for files. It creates a secondary location where decisions can split, where ownership becomes blurry, and where people eventually stop knowing which space holds the final authority. Instead of providing coordination, the collaboration layer starts producing nothing but ambiguity. This is the part that most people miss. Flexible collaboration and unmanaged entropy are not the same thing. Leaders often try to defend chaos because they believe it promotes agility. They want teams to work however they want, without friction or heavy governance, and that instinct makes sense when you're just starting out. But at an enterprise scale, low friction without any structural patterns becomes incredibly expensive. It creates a hidden operational debt that the organization pays for every day through repeated searching and constant clarifying of context. This is structural compensation in action. People start creating massive summary documents because the chat channels are too noisy to follow. They schedule extra meetings because the history of a decision is impossible to trace. They keep private copies of files because the shared spaces feel unreliable and messy. They ask the same questions over and over because the answer exists somewhere, but they don't trust the place where it's stored. When we talk about collaboration architecture, we are really asking what patterns the platform allows for shared work. Are channels created with a clear purpose in mind? And do those sites have known owners who are responsible for them? Are there rules for when a space should be archived or deleted? And is external sharing handled in a way that is proportional to the risk? Can your teams actually tell the difference between a temporary workspace and a zone that is critical to the enterprise? These might sound like boring operational questions, but they are the primary drivers of business outcomes. The collaboration layer is the place where unstructured work either becomes a reusable asset or is lost forever. This is why standard patterns are so important. I'm not talking about rigid uniformity that kills creativity. I'm talking about repeatable patterns. You need a small number of workspace types, clear expectations for ownership, and defined purposes for every site and channel. You need visibility into abandoned spaces and structured ways to handle external access. That kind of pattern library does something essential. It preserves flexibility while drastically reducing randomness. From a system perspective, randomness is the absolute enemy of resilience. If every single team is allowed to invent its own collaboration model, the business inherits an estate that no one can govern or search reliably. But if you define a handful of patterns that map to real business needs, then flexibility stops being chaotic and starts being intentional. That is the move that defines a mature organization. You aren't locking everything down. You are making collaboration legible enough to trust. Once collaboration becomes the place where the actual work happens, every weakness in that structure becomes a major operational risk. This affects the users, but it also impacts audit, compliance, and the performance of your AI. It affects how well the business continues when teams change and how well processes integrate across different functions. The collaboration layer sits right at the center of the enterprise operating system. Identity controls who can get in, data shapes what can be known. But collaboration determines how business context is formed and retained while the work is actually moving. When that layer is weak, the entire platform feels busy, but brittle. This is exactly why the next layer cannot be treated as an afterthought. Once risk and retention enter the conversation, collaboration stops being only about speed. It becomes inseparable from control. The compliance layer. Now we get to the compliance layer, and this is where a lot of organizations still make a serious category mistake. They treat compliance as something that happens after the real work is done, as if you build the platform first and then bolt on the controls later. But if Microsoft 365 is functioning like an enterprise operating system, compliance is not a downstream add-on because it is actually part of the operating design from the very start. What is compliance really doing here? It is defining how the business proves control. It is how you retain records and protect sensitive information. It is how the system limits exposure and reconstructs events when something goes wrong. That is not peripheral. That is core operating behavior. Once you see it that way, tools like Purview, sensitivity labels, and DLP stop looking like specialist features for the legal team and start looking like control surfaces for business reality. These tools determine whether the platform can actually carry trust at scale. But here's the thing. Controls only work as well as the structure beneath them. You can switch on labels today, but if ownership is unclear and your content lives in 10 inconsistent places, your label coverage will always stay patchy. You can configure retention policies, but if collaboration spaces are duplicated and the lifecycle is unmanaged, that retention becomes almost impossible to interpret. From a system perspective, that is not strong compliance, it is just performative compliance. The checkbox exists. The operational confidence does not. I keep pushing back on the idea that governance is friction because bad governance is the only thing that actually slows you down. When governance arrives too late, after the estate has already sprawled into chaos, it feels like a punishment. But compliance as an operating discipline creates predictability, and it tells the people inside the system exactly what kind of environment they are working in. That predictability matters more now because AI raises the stakes. Once Copilot and agents start interacting with your tenant, compliance boundaries become active in entirely new ways. Prompt protection and data exposure are no longer quiet hygiene issues. They are amplified risk surfaces. If AI can reason across your content at high speed, then unlabeled or over-permissioned information becomes a massive liability. This is exactly why ongoing operation matters more than a one-time setup. Microsoft 365 keeps changing, Copilot keeps changing, and the admin tools for DLP and agent controls are constantly shifting. If the platform changes every week, but your governance model only changes once a year, drift is guaranteed. A static compliance model becomes outdated almost immediately because the platform itself is dynamic. That is the business implication. Audit readiness is not a reporting trick. It is a design outcome. If someone asks who had access or what policy applied to a specific file, can you answer them cleanly? If you can't, the issue is rarely that the logs don't exist, but rather that the environment was never structured to make those answers legible. In this model, compliance is not the team that says no, it is the layer that makes safe scale possible. It gives the platform a memory with rules, it gives your automation clear boundaries, it gives AI a governed context to work within. Most importantly, it gives leadership a way to trust that business acceleration is not quietly creating unmanaged exposure. The more these layers connect inside one tenant, the less tool language makes sense. Tools are optional, but these layers are interacting all the time, producing business behavior, whether you have named that reality or not. Why adoption without architecture creates invisible complexity. Now we get to one of the most expensive misunderstandings in the whole Microsoft 365 story. Organizations often treat adoption as proof of maturity, assuming that because people are using Teams and SharePoint, the platform is working perfectly. But usage and architecture are not the same thing, and if you separate those two ideas for too long, the business starts paying for it in silence. Adoption tells you the people inside the system found value. Architecture tells you whether that value can scale without creating hidden drag. This is what invisible complexity looks like in practice. A local team solves a problem with a new team, another builds a list, and someone else creates a SharePoint site just to move faster. Each decision makes sense up close, which is why the problem is so easy to miss. No single action looks irresponsible because people are just doing what capable people always do. They are optimizing for the work right in front of them. But when local optimization happens without architectural intent, the tenant starts accumulating a massive amount of cross-business complexity that nobody explicitly chose. Every local solution leaves behind a footprint, whether it's a permission model, a naming logic, or a duplicate data surface. Multiply that across every department and region, and suddenly you aren't operating one coherent platform anymore. You are operating layers of informal design decisions stacked on top of each other. From the outside, it can still look productive. People are active, documents exist, and workflows are running. But the cost shows up in the friction. Search confidence drops, decision cycles slow down, and automation becomes brittle. This is where the phrase adoption without architecture really starts to matter. Adoption programs are built to increase usage through training and champions, which is all necessary, but none of that defines safe, scalable behavior by itself. Architecture does something different. It defines the patterns that shape what happens when adoption actually succeeds. It determines where truth should live, how access works, and what happens when environments begin to drift. Without that layer, success produces entropy. It doesn't happen immediately, but that gradual growth is exactly why many leaders miss the shift until it's too late. The platform keeps functioning, so the complexity stays hidden inside what I call structural compensation. More policies get added because the structure is weak. More meetings get scheduled because trust is inconsistent. More manual reviews are required because automation feels too risky. The business keeps trying to stabilize outcomes without redesigning the conditions that are producing them. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do, but it is just not set up for what the organization now expects. This is where AI and automation become the ultimate stress tests for your infrastructure. Organic growth works for a while when the cost of inconsistency is low. But once you ask the platform to ground AI or survive a major organizational change, that hidden complexity stops being invisible and starts being operational friction. You see it in the workspaces nobody wants to archive because nobody knows what will break if they disappear. That is not a sign that your people failed. It is a sign that the platform grew faster than the operating model around it. So if you want a useful checkpoint, don't just ask if people have adopted Microsoft 365. Ask what kind of business complexity that adoption has been creating underneath the surface this whole time. Once you see that clearly, the question is no longer about how to govern everything the same way. It becomes a question of how to create enough structure to scale without destroying the flexibility that made the platform useful in the first place. The need for zones, not uniform control. This is exactly where most governance efforts fall apart. When leadership sees complexity, the natural instinct is to flatten it out, but that usually results in one rigid policy for every workspace and one approval model for every single use case. They try to force a single control posture onto every team, process, and data type in the organization. From a management perspective, that sounds like efficiency, but from a system perspective, it creates a massive structural failure. It treats every piece of work as if it carries the exact same risk and business value. But we know they don't. A personal note space is not the same thing as a finance approval workflow, and a temporary project channel shouldn't be governed like a regulated record repository. You cannot treat a small team experimenting with an internal process the same way you treat a tenant-wide knowledge surface that grounds your AI responses. When organizations apply flat governance to a layered platform, one of two things usually happens. Either the control becomes so heavy that people find ways to root around it, or the rules stay so generic that they protect almost nothing important. That is why I believe the better model is using zones instead of uniform control. Zones allow you to match your operating discipline to the actual business reality on the ground. And why is that so important? It's because proportional governance scales better than ideological governance. It gives your people enough freedom where flexibility is useful, but it maintains enough structure where a failure would actually cause damage. You can think about this through three specific zones. Zone 1 is the personal zone. This is where individual productivity lives, including draft notes, early thinking, and light experimentation. It's low-risk material that helps a person move faster before their work becomes part of the shared business context.
You still monitor the environment and apply baseline security, but you don't treat a personal scratchpad like an enterprise control surface.
Zone 2 is the collaborative zone. This is where teams coordinate shared work in department spaces and project sites where knowledge is being shaped together. In this zone, you need stronger reviews, clearer ownership, and sensible naming conventions. The moment work becomes shared, it starts affecting the business memory, so you need lifecycle expectations and structural standards to keep it clean. Zone 3 is the enterprise zone. This is where the platform carries business-critical knowledge, regulated data, and the workflows that other teams depend on to function. The controls here must be much stricter, requiring strong ownership, clear metadata, and constant access reviews. If these areas start to drift, the business feels the impact almost immediately. The real value of this model isn't just that it sounds neat on paper. The value is that it finally makes your governance explainable to the people using it. People can actually understand why one area has light monitoring while another requires a formal review process. Security teams can finally align their controls to actual exposure, and builders know exactly what is expected of them before they even start creating. This gives leadership a model that reflects business impact instead of just admin preference. That clarity matters because random friction destroys trust in governance just as fast as missing controls destroy trust in the platform itself. Zones also happen to be the foundation for AI readiness. Not every space should be equally important for Copilot grounding or automation, because some areas are just experimental while others are trusted operating surfaces. If you don't distinguish between these categories, the platform can never mature intentionally, and everything stays in a state of being half-governed. From a system perspective, being half-governed is inherently unstable. It creates a false sense of confidence in low-risk areas while providing weak protection in high-risk areas. When that happens, people start compensating with side spreadsheets and just-in-case meetings, and the old patterns of chaos return. Zones break that cycle because they create visible design intent. They tell the user that one space is flexible by design, another is shared and reviewable, and the third is critical and must stay legible. That is a much better conversation than arguing whether governance should be strict or loose. Generalizing is the problem, and a platform this central needs differentiated control. If you want to reduce invisible complexity without killing adoption, you have to start here. Define the zones, decide what belongs in each one, and set the minimum control posture for them. You need to make that model visible enough that the people inside the system can work with it instead of fighting against it. Once flexibility becomes intentional rather than random, the entire tenant becomes much easier to trust. But even a perfect model like this won't solve the core issue on its own. A good design still breaks down if nobody actually owns the platform it's supposed to govern. The ownership gap at the center of the tenant. This is where the conversation usually gets a bit uncomfortable. Once we start talking about zones and operating discipline, one question becomes impossible to avoid. Who actually owns this platform as a business system? I'm not asking who administers it or who patches the parts. I'm not asking who joins a governance call once a month to look at slides. I'm asking who owns the actual operating reality of the tenant. In a surprising number of organizations, the honest answer is that no one does. You might have skilled admins, security leads, and compliance stakeholders. You might even have a steering group that meets regularly. But having a group of interested parties is not the same thing as having true ownership. Ownership means someone has the mandate to make hard trade-offs across the entire platform. You need someone who can decide where standardization matters and where flexibility is okay. Someone has to decide what gets funded, what gets cleaned up, and what operating principles the business will actually live by. Without that specific role, the tenant is just a shared dependency with no strategic steward. From a system perspective, that is a very fragile way to run a business. A global administrator is not the same as a platform owner. That role gives you technical power, but it does not automatically create business accountability. A governance committee isn't ownership either, because committees are designed to review and recommend, not to carry day-to-day responsibility for how the platform behaves. This distinction is vital because Microsoft 365 is now shaping business behavior every single hour. If nobody owns those outcomes, the platform just drifts based on local pressure and whoever happens to be shouting the loudest this week. That isn't a strategy, it's just unmanaged emergence. You might think that IT already owns Microsoft 365, but they usually only own service availability and support. While those are important, technical custody is far too narrow once the platform becomes an enterprise operating system. The real question isn't just whether the service is running, but whether the platform is producing trustworthy behavior across your data and your AI. That is a business platform question, and those questions require named ownership. You can call the role whatever fits your culture, whether it's the head of digital workplace or an M365 product owner. The title matters much less than the actual accountability. There has to be one role that can hold the center and define the operating principles and the zones we use. Without that central point, every function just optimizes for its own narrow concern. Security pushes for tighter control, while the adoption teams push for lower friction. Compliance wants traceability, the business wants speed, and the admins just want something they can support. All of those goals are rational, but they are all incomplete on their own. If nobody owns the whole platform logic, those forces don't stay balanced. They just become political. The tenant turns into a negotiation space instead of a functional operating model. That is the gap sitting at the center of most environments today. It isn't a lack of features or a lack of tooling that holds companies back. It is the total lack of accountable platform ownership. This brings me to a point that leaders often underestimate. Shared responsibility can be a very useful thing, but shared accountability is usually a major warning sign. When everyone is only partly responsible, the hard decisions just get deferred indefinitely. Workspace sprawl continues because cleaning it up is inconvenient for everyone involved. Ownership reviews stay incomplete because no one has the actual authority to escalate them. Even your AI readiness will stall because the data and security teams are just waiting on each other to move first. The platform keeps moving forward, but it does so without a single clear hand on the wheel. That is exactly how structural risk grows in plain sight. If you want a simple way to diagnose this, just ask one question. Who can make a cross-functional decision about Microsoft 365 that binds the business, security, and IT models together? If the answer is unclear, you've found your ownership gap. Once you see that gap, the next move becomes much easier to figure out. The issue is no longer about finding the right settings in the tenant. It's about what executive ownership must actually do once it finally exists. What executive ownership must actually do. So what does executive ownership actually look like when you move past the buzzwords? I'm not talking about sponsorship in that soft, hands-off sense where a leader just signs a check. It isn't about a keep me informed CC on an email, and it certainly isn't a steering committee that meets once a quarter just to react to things that are already broken. What I am talking about is operational ownership of a business platform. That shift starts when you begin defining outcomes instead of just listing services. Most Microsoft 365 conversations happen too low in the stack, focusing on things like email uptime, Teams usage, or how many support tickets are in the queue. While those metrics matter for maintenance, they tell you absolutely nothing about what the platform is actually producing for the business. Executive ownership has to sit one level higher and ask what business outcomes this environment must reliably support. Are we trying to create faster decision cycles or cleaner coordination across different departments? Maybe the goal is safer information sharing, AI-ready knowledge flows, or better visibility for audits. If you don't name these outcomes specifically, the platform defaults to random activity instead of clear direction. The second part of the job is defining your operating principles. This is where ownership gets real because principles are what turn a vague ambition into a repeatable decision. You have to decide what should be flexible by default and what needs to be structured. You need to know where external sharing is a normal part of the day and where it has to be tightly controlled. Without these guardrails, every single team makes these choices locally, and local logic never adds up to a coherent system at an enterprise scale. The third task is to pick one or two critical business flows and turn them into a proving ground. Most organizations fail here because they spread themselves too thin by trying to fix everything at once. They talk about tenant transformation and AI readiness in a way that sounds ambitious but actually creates structural drift. Executive ownership should narrow the focus to specific flows like a finance approval path or a cross-functional board reporting workflow. When you pick flows where bad structure creates a visible cost, you can finally standardize how knowledge and permissions work. That is how the platform starts becoming governable in a way the business can actually feel. The fourth job is establishing a real operating review. This isn't a project check-in, it's a management practice. A monthly rhythm is usually best because the platform moves too fast for a quarterly cycle to stay useful. This review shouldn't just be a collection of usage charts. It needs to cover risk signals, oversharing exposure, and where you have gaps in ownership or workspace drift. When you track value realization in those specific business flows, you stop treating governance like a static document and start treating it like a live system. The fifth job is alignment, which is often the hardest part of the process. Microsoft 365 cuts across functions that usually speak different languages and have different incentives. IT wants supportability, security wants a small blast radius, and the business teams just want to move fast. Without executive ownership, these groups end up with competing agendas. With ownership, someone holds the integrated picture and makes the trade-offs explicit. You aren't looking for maximum security or maximum flexibility at any cost. You are looking for fit-for-purpose behavior. There is one more responsibility that has become vital in the age of AI. Executive ownership must treat your rollout, your governance, and your AI enablement as a single product problem. If these stay in separate silos, you are creating a structural disconnect by design. The business experiences one single platform, and your operating model should reflect that reality. If I had to boil the executive move down to its essence, it would be this: name the platform, name the owner, and name the principles. Once those things are visible, the tenant stops acting like a loose collection of tools and starts behaving like an intentional business environment. That is the true turning point. It isn't about the technology changing, it's about leadership accepting that the platform is already producing their business reality and managing it accordingly. What changed? When the retail organization reframed the tenant. When this retail organization finally turned things around, the first thing that changed wasn't the technology stack. It was the lens they used to see it. Before the shift, they were managing Microsoft 365 entirely through an adoption lens. On paper, everything looked healthy because Teams activity was high and people were clearly collaborating more than they used to. Their reporting was built around visible participation, like how many meetings moved out of email, which gave the illusion of momentum. But once Copilot arrived and exposed the underlying mess, they had to stop asking if the platform was being used and start asking what kind of behavior it was producing. That single shift changed everything about their strategy. Instead of seeing the tenant as a loose playground, they started treating it as a business platform with real operating consequences. They realized they needed intentional design rather than just more encouragement. To fix this, they started by creating specific zones for different types of work. Personal productivity stayed flexible, but team collaboration spaces moved into clear review patterns with named owners. For enterprise-critical areas, they applied a much stricter posture regarding permissions and purpose. This move alone removed a massive amount of ambiguity because employees no longer had to guess if a space was temporary or operationally important. Then they took a hard look at ownership. Before the reframe, responsibility was scattered across the organization. One person might own a team, another knew the process, and IT owned the support tickets, but nobody actually owned the business design. They fixed this by establishing clear accountability for core spaces. Once ownership became visible, the massive task of cleaning up the environment finally became possible. They didn't do a dramatic one-time purge of the system. Instead, they focused on the spaces creating the most confusion and duplication. By identifying unused or weakly owned workspaces, they made lifecycle discipline a reality rather than a theory. The goal wasn't just cosmetic tidiness, it was making the environment legible so that people could actually trust the data they found. The next big change involved their business flows. Rather than trying to govern every single corner of the tenant at once, they picked a few critical processes and standardized exactly how they would function. They defined where the information lived, who owned the permissions, and which automations were allowed. This created a stable core and gave the rest of the organization a clear example of what good actually looked like. The leadership team realized that people don't need a perfect architecture everywhere on the first day. What they actually need is a governable baseline that the business can rely on for daily operations. Once that baseline was in place, Copilot started behaving differently. The AI model itself hadn't changed, but the environment it was scanning had become much easier to reason across. Because there was less duplication and clearer ownership, the AI's outputs became more reliable. Trust improved specifically in the areas where the organization had applied discipline first. This is the pattern that leaders need to grasp. They didn't buy a transformation. They changed the design of their system, and the outcomes followed that shift. Decision-making became faster because teams weren't wasting time reconciling scattered context. Audit visibility improved because the important spaces were finally easy to interpret. Most importantly, the conversation at the leadership level changed completely. Microsoft 365 was no longer just collaboration software to them, it was recognized as vital operating infrastructure. That realization changed the quality of every decision they made regarding funding and AI readiness. Once they understood the tenant as the engine of the business, they stopped waiting for technology to rescue a weak structure. They took responsibility for the structure itself. And in the era of AI, that is the only way to win. Why this matters more in the AI era. And this is where the whole argument becomes harder to ignore, because AI raises the cost of a weak structure very quickly. In the collaboration era, a messy environment could still function for a surprisingly long time because people compensated for the chaos. They asked colleagues where things lived, they checked files manually, and they worked around confusion with meetings and local memory. It was slow and frustrating, but it was still a survivable way to do business. AI changes that equation. Because AI does not operate like a patient employee who senses ambiguity and slows down, it works at platform speed instead. It interprets what is available, follows the permissions it is given, and produces outputs based on the environment as it exists right now. So if the structure is weak, the weakness does not stay hidden but instead gets surfaced and amplified. That is the real shift. AI uses existing platform conditions at machine speed. And why is that important? Because leaders often expect AI to sit above the mess and somehow create order from it, but that is not what is actually happening. Copilot, agents, and orchestration layers are grounded in tenant reality, which means they rely on permissions, labels, and content structure. If those are strong, AI feels useful very quickly, but if those are weak, AI becomes a very efficient way to reveal that the business does not actually trust its own operating environment. Which brings me to agents. We are moving from AI that mostly summarizes and drafts toward AI that can coordinate actions across systems, which means the platform is no longer only generating insight, it is increasingly participating in execution. And once that happens, the stakes change again. A weakly governed knowledge surface can produce a shaky summary. A weakly governed action surface can produce a bad business outcome. That is a very different risk profile. If an agent can access the wrong information or trigger the wrong flow, then structural weakness starts turning into operational exposure. Oversharing scales faster and errors travel further, which makes accountability harder to trace and causes trust to drop faster than most rollout teams are prepared for. From a system perspective, this is not an AI problem. It is an operating model problem under higher load. And the organizations that do well in this phase are usually not the ones with the most ambitious AI language, but the ones with the clearest platform conditions. They focus on clear ownership, better permissions hygiene, and a better distinction between flexible collaboration and trusted operating surfaces. In other words, they focus on structural resilience. That phrase matters here, because in the AI era, resilience is not only about cybersecurity or uptime, it is about whether the platform can absorb more automation without becoming less trustworthy. Can the business increase machine participation without increasing confusion? And can it move faster without creating invisible risk? Can it automate with confidence instead of just crossing its fingers? That is the leadership test now. And this is also why I think the future is not more apps, but more orchestration across the same estate. The center of gravity is shifting, less time is spent jumping between separate tools, and more time is spent working through a coordinated environment where identity and data interact continuously. That is exactly why the enterprise operating system frame matters more now than it did even 2 years ago, because the platform is becoming more connected and more consequential. So if Microsoft 365 is already running key parts of the business, then AI does not mark the beginning of that reality. AI marks the end of the illusion that this was ever just a software suite. And once you see that clearly, the leadership question changes. It is no longer, should we adopt AI inside Microsoft 365? It becomes, is the business platform underneath that AI designed to sustain speed, trust, and control at the same time? The leadership reframe. So this is the leadership reframe. Stop asking whether Microsoft 365 is fully adopted. That question belongs to an earlier stage when the main concern was rollout and usage, but it is not enough now. Because once the platform starts carrying identity, knowledge, and process, adoption becomes a lagging signal that only tells you people are inside the environment. It does not tell you what the environment is actually producing. And that is the real executive question now. What business behavior is this platform producing? Is it speeding decisions up, or is it forcing people to reconcile too many versions of the truth? Is it making knowledge more reusable, or is it burying it in collaboration noise? Is it increasing trust, or is it increasing the dependency on manual checking? Is it creating structural resilience, or just more digital activity? That is a very different lens. Because if you look closely, most leaders are still measuring Microsoft 365 like a bundle of tools by looking at usage and meeting counts. But platforms this central have to be measured by what they do to business flow, which means looking at decision speed and trust in outputs. When you only measure productivity, you miss the cost of structural weakness. A team can be highly active and still be generating confusion, and a tenant can show strong adoption while still accumulating risk. A Copilot rollout can show initial usage and still be heading toward a trust collapse because the platform underneath it is incoherent. That is why governance has to be reframed too. Stop treating governance as friction. Treat it as operating discipline. Friction is what people feel when control is random or disconnected from real work. But operating discipline is what makes scale possible. It defines where structure matters and how the environment stays legible as more people and more agents interact inside it. From a system perspective, governance is not the thing slowing the business down. Weak structure is. Weak structure creates the extra approvals and the rework that drains time from the organization. Weak structure creates the second meeting because the first decision was not anchored cleanly. Weak structure creates the hesitation around AI because nobody fully trusts what it will surface or act on. So this is not a technology maturity conversation alone. It is an organizational design conversation. Microsoft 365 is no longer supporting the business from the side, but is instead participating in how the business coordinates and acts. That means platform design becomes management design, and the tenant is not separate from business reality, but is part of the mechanism producing it. And that has consequences for leadership language. If you keep calling this a collaboration suite, the organization will keep delegating it like software. If you keep calling governance a security issue, the business will keep distancing itself from platform behavior. If you keep framing Copilot as an innovation layer, people will keep expecting AI to compensate for weak operating conditions underneath it. None of those frames are strong enough anymore. The stronger frame is this: Microsoft 365 is part of the business operating model. Therefore, it needs the same clarity we expect from any other operating system. Ownership, principles, control boundaries, review cycles, design intent. Once leadership sees that, the conversation improves very quickly. Funding decisions improve because cleanup stops looking optional, and governance improves because it is linked to scale rather than fear. AI decisions improve because readiness is assessed structurally, and business teams engage differently because they can see that the platform is shaping how work behaves. So if I was sitting with an executive team, I would reduce the whole reframe to 3 questions. What behavior is our platform producing today? Where is that behavior creating resilience, and where is it creating drag? And are we managing Microsoft 365 like infrastructure the business runs on, or like software the business happens to use? Because once those questions are on the table, the next move becomes obvious. You stop debating the category, and you start acting like owners of the environment that is already running a meaningful share of your business. The next 30 days, so let's make this practical. If you are responsible for Microsoft 365 or for the business outcomes now running through it, your next move isn't a massive transformation program. It isn't another broad adoption campaign, and it certainly isn't a generic AI strategy deck that nobody will actually read. The next 30 days are about naming reality and creating a governable baseline. First, you need to formally define Microsoft 365 as a business operating system inside your organization. That sounds like a small change, but it shifts the conversation immediately because language shapes accountability. If the platform is still described as collaboration software, it will keep being managed like a support service, but once it is named as operating infrastructure, leaders start asking better questions about ownership, risk, and flow design. That shift matters because people usually act according to the category they're given, so you have to change the category first. Second, assign one accountable owner who has real cross-functional backing. You don't need 5 partial owners or a loose committee that meets once a month. You need one accountable role. That person does not need to do everything personally, but they do need the authority to integrate the interests of IT, security, and compliance into a single operating model. Without that single point of responsibility, the next month will just become another round of fragmented recommendations that never get implemented. Name the owner, make the mandate explicit, and ensure executive leadership backs it visibly. Third, define your initial operating principles. Keep this simple enough for people to actually use. You need to decide what should stay flexible and what must become structured, or where external sharing is acceptable and what kinds of workspaces need a stronger review process. You also need to know the minimum ownership expectation for a shared environment and what happens to inactive or abandoned spaces. You do not need a perfect doctrine in 30 days, but you do need a usable baseline. If you skip this step, every later cleanup decision becomes a debate that drains your energy. Fourth, define your zone model: personal, collaborative, enterprise. That model gives the whole tenant a clearer shape, and it tells people what kind of environment they are in and what kind of control posture comes with it. It also gives security and compliance teams something much better than blanket restrictions because it provides them with proportional logic. This is where flexibility stops being random. For a lot of organizations, that one move already reduces friction because people finally understand why some areas are light touch while others are governed more tightly. Fifth, choose 1 or 2 critical business flows. This is the shortcut nobody teaches you. Don't try to fix the entire estate at once, but instead pick the flows where weak platform design is already creating a visible cost to the business. Maybe it is a board reporting flow or a finance approval process. It could be a store operations escalation chain or contract collaboration across legal and business teams. Pick flows that matter enough for leadership to care and are concrete enough for teams to improve. Then ask very direct questions. Where does authoritative information live? Who owns that space? And how are the permissions managed? You need to know what records must be retained and where the duplicates are hiding, because that is what Copilot or an agent will actually see when they enter the system. That is how architecture becomes real. Sixth, run a focused assessment of 4 specific problem areas: permissions, labels, workspace sprawl, ownership gaps. This isn't a 6-month discovery exercise, but a focused assessment designed to find the places where the tenant is least legible and most exposed. You are looking for over-permissioned spaces, unlabeled sensitive areas, and critical environments with unclear ownership. If you can surface those patterns quickly, you can start reducing risk and improving trust without pretending you need to solve every single problem first. And this is important. You must resist the urge to turn this into broad ambition. Do not say you are making the whole platform AI ready in 30 days, and do not claim you are redesigning the digital workplace end to end. That kind of language creates structural overreach that the system can't handle. Build a small, governable operating baseline instead. One owner, one zone model, one set of initial principles, 1 or 2 priority flows, one focused assessment. That is enough to change the trajectory. Once those things are in place, the platform starts telling a different story and decisions become easier to anchor while cleanup becomes easier to justify. AI conversations become more grounded, governance becomes more explainable, and leadership can finally see where Microsoft 365 is producing resilience and where it is still producing drag. That is the real 30-day outcome. It isn't about perfection or maturity theater. It's about visible design intent. From a system perspective, visible design intent is the beginning of trust. So that's the shift. Microsoft 365 is no longer just collaboration software, it is operating infrastructure for business reality. If this helped you rethink your tenant more structurally, leave a review for the podcast, connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn, and tell me which part of your environment already behaves like an operating system and where it's quietly creating risk.